Hey there, and welcome to your video on topics 5.6, pest control methods, and topic 5.14, which is integrated pest management. So your first questions are about genetically modified crops. We're going to be discussing this a little bit more in class, but you need to realize in general that genetically modified crops are a subset of artificial selection. Humans have been tinkering with the DNA of plants and animals that we use for food since we started having plants and animals for food around us. Advent of agriculture is about 10,000 years ago. Up until recently, our only ability to tinker with the genetics is through artificial selection. So you pick your plants that give you the highest yield and you cross-pollinate them. You purposely take a little bit of pollen from this one and pollen from that one, and you make sure that they specifically do interact with each other genetically, and then you save only those seeds. And then next year, your entire crop is full of those ones that have the bigger fruit or the greater yield or whatever, and then you continue to crossbreed them until you end up with the max yield for those genetics. Livestock is like that as well. I don't know if you've actually seen a cow that produces milk, but they have udders where they can produce milk for 20 calves. I mean, the whole point of producing milk in a cow is for your young. And we just kept breeding bulls that were, which are boy cows, that were given birth to by moms that had extra large udders and produced more milk. And we crossed them with cows that produce more milk until we eventually have the cows who are able to give more milk than they could give to a lifetime of cows. And we harness that milk for ourselves. So anyway, we've been doing this for a long time. We just now have basically found a shortcut, and then B, a way of combining the DNA of organisms that literally could not possibly cross. And I'm going to get into a specific of that. So sorry, let me go back to my questions here. 1 second. Okay, so explain how bacteria are used to genetically modify crop varieties. So it is, let's see if they, okay, so you insert traits. I'm trying to see if I put this question together thinking that they went over specifically what I was talking about. No, they don't specifically go into it, so I'm going to just show you what you need to know here, but then I'm going to kind of go from there. So how does this work? So you find a bit of DNA. This is very common. You may want to tuck this into the back of your head. This Bacillus, just the Bt bacteria, let's just go ahead and go with that. That's what it's called, capital B, lowercase t. Right here, so the Bt gene, which produces a protein that turns toxic in the digestive tract of caterpillars. So in other words, this bacteria produces an enzyme that essentially kills caterpillars. And then you take it from the bacteria and you splice it into a plant so it produces basically its own pesticide. This is a benefit because now you're not having to spray pesticide all over the place, and then it inadvertently kills things you don't want it to kill. And it's very specifically targeting one particular type of pest. So this is something that happens a lot. One of the things that they don't say in here is how exactly the splicing occurs. And we do now use bacteria to go ahead and do the actual insertion of this gene. But again, you could never get bacteria and plants to cross to create this. You have to actually do this in the lab and create the seeds that make this happen. Now, sometimes this is a trait that can be then passed down from plant to plant to plant, and then sometimes you have to do it with every single plant that you want to do this every single time. It just kind of depends. All right, so how common are GM crops? Very common. They've been in our food stream for a couple of decades now. So, that insect resistance that I was talking about is in corn, a longer shelf life tomato, faster growing salmon. I mean, all of this is very common. And so, again, you can do this very quickly, and this is key. A genetically modified, in general, means that you're taking the DNA from one completely different species of organism, and putting it into something completely other, where they would never actually be able to do that naturally. So they're very common. See, half the world's genetically modified crops are planted in the United States. The European Union, on the other hand, they do not, they don't use as many GM crops as we do. They're kind of banned in a lot of places, and it's because of some concerns they have, and it's basically here. Unpredictable genetic and ecological effect. It doesn't mean that occasionally they'll create some sentient plant. It means that we just don't know how this is going to end up being a problem. But notice all of the words that are being used. Unpredictable, may, and could. These are all largely unproven. Bill Nye, the science guy, initially started out not being super excited about GM crops because there wasn't a lot of research behind them, but has since changed his mind and said they've been around for 2 decades, and we have literally no proof that any of this is occurring. To me, the only one of these that might actually take place would be this one right here. You're going to learn why this is a problem. Can promote pesticide-resistant insects and herbicide-resistant weeds. There is a very simple evolutionary reason why that's the case. We will, like I said, discuss. Sorry, I'm trying to adjust the light here so that hopefully you can see this a little bit better. Okay, so let's see what else. I just went off on a 6-minute tangent. Sorry about that. Give an example of a GM crop and what its modification is. Like I said, corn that has that Bt gene that produces a pesticide that naturally kills caterpillars, as an example. Tomatoes also, again, longer shelf life means that they are, it takes longer for them to rot than unmodified tomatoes. How do U.S. policies regarding GM crops differ from GM crop? Sorry, my computer just went out. How do U.S. policies regarding GM crops differ from GM crop policies in Europe? We're fine with it. Europe is not. It's basically 2 different philosophies. In the United States, it's very much innocent until proven guilty. So after a certain number of tests, we'll go ahead and introduce it if we're fairly certain that things are okay. And it can be anything, a food crop, medicine, anything like that. In Europe, they have what's called the precautionary principle, which is basically, well, unless you can prove it's okay, let's go ahead and be very cautious with what's going on. And you can see again here, they restrict the use of GM seeds and importation of products containing GM food. And then in their country, unlike ours, you cannot use genetically modified organisms if you're going to call it organic. Again, it's still too early for scientists to know the long-term effects. But I mean, 20 years is a decent amount. And there are some very compelling pros, which you need to look over here. If you are genetically modified to survive in what's called an arid climate, which means not a lot of water, it means you have to use less water. You can maximize yield through genetic modification. You can make plants so they grow in salty conditions, in extreme heat, and still produce fruit. All of these things are very valuable to countries that are starving right now. So that is where this can be a good thing. One of the things we're going to talk about in class is something called golden rice. A lack of vitamin A when you're a little guy, and by lack I mean like getting none your first 2 years, can lead to permanent blindness as you get older. And so there's been a strain of rice that's developed that has a precursor of vitamin A in it, making it gold. The precursor of vitamin A is beta carotene, which is the orange thing, the orange component of carrots. And so it would be really cool if we could get vitamin A into little guys through a food they eat anyway, which is rice. It has not been released to the general public quite yet. I want to say that that is finally starting to move forward, but we'll discuss that more in class. Again, more yields. This one right here, tolerate higher level of herbicide. We're also going to talk about that in class. We grow a type of soybean here in the United States called Roundup Ready, meaning that you can spray the soybean with herbicide, which is a weed killer, called Roundup, and which is glyphosate, and you can the soybeans won't die, but all the weeds around it will. Why is that good? It means you don't have to be super precise with your killing of weeds. It makes your the farmer's life a lot quicker and easier to deal with things. Now, there are some other disadvantages that are not listed, which is this. It is an economic disadvantage, which is those seeds are patented, meaning that farmers can't do what they've always done, which is you save the seeds from your best plants and then plant them again next year. It's literally against the law. It's even against the law if pollen from another person's plants that are genetically modified land on your not genetically modified plants and fertilize them. You can be sued for stealing. You can be sued for saving seeds. You have to buy the seeds again every single year, and that is expensive for farmers, and especially if you're talking about developing countries, that may make it so that you're essentially beholden to whatever price the company wants to sell them to you for. So this idea of patenting genetics and DNA is something our laws haven't kept up with, and it's providing grounds for some very interesting lawsuits. Again, that is something that we will talk more in depth on in class. So let's see if I've actually addressed any of these questions. All right, what are the benefits and drawbacks? I already talked about that. How are GMOs used as a pest control method? 2 ways. So again, one of the ways that I talked about is that it controls, it can put out its own herbicide. Let's see. And what is the second way? So makes its own herbicide, or excuse me, its own pesticide here. And then let's see what else. Animals, And the other one is again where you can spray it and it's not going to be an issue. So yeah, pretty much this entire page is going to be really importante for you. Yeah, definitely know, like I said, this BT gene that can be inserted so that organisms can create their own pesticide. Okay, so let's see what else. And here, oh, here's another one here. You can give the plant a bad taste. And again, the compound toxic to a specific pest. So those are the 2 right there. I wanted to make sure I gave you everything that you needed. What is a pest? All right, so we're going to go ahead and turn to page 355. All right. A pest is a very human word. It is any species that interferes with human welfare. It's very situational. As an example, if you have lawn grass growing in your lawn, good thing. If that lawn grass decides to go into your borders where the bushes are and you don't want it, it's a pest in there. So labeling an animal a pest doesn't mean it's bad. It's just it's not where you want it. So grasshoppers are pests when they're in a field. But, you know, obviously they serve a purpose in our everyday life, not everyday life, excuse me, in their ecosystem where, you know, they've gone through evolution to fill a niche. Anyway, so you can see right here that there aren't a whole lot of species that target what we eat, which shouldn't be surprising considering that we don't grow a lot of plants and animals to eat. Let's see, how do monocultures like crops disrupt the natural control of pests? So it's super easy. When you have a monoculture, you upset many of the natural population checks and balances that are in keeping with biodiversity. That means that their natural predators don't live there. Whether you take away their habitat or you spray and kill them, the natural food webs that would keep these things in check are gone. And side note, please make sure that you don't get scared by this, because these little guys make food possible. You can see kill far more crop-eating insects every year than humans kill with insecticide. So thank you, spiders. What is a synthetic pesticide? There we go. Chemicals used to kill or control organisms we consider to be pests. And they're ones that we make. They're not ones that are naturally occurring in the environment. So you can see all the different ones. Insecticides shockingly kill insects. That's not super difficult. But please realize on a national exam, if you are not sure what type of pest you are talking about, please just say pesticide. Because if you say fungicide and you want it to kill a caterpillar, no points. Make sure that if you're being specific with your pesticide, that you're talking about the right thing. Identify the highest profile second generation pesticide. This is something we will loop back to. It is, you don't have to know this whole mouthful right here, which is dichloryl diphenyl trichloroethane. It's just DDT. This was created in 1939. This is the first of the so-called second generation pesticides because this was made in the lab. First generation pesticides are when you used a plant that occurs in the natural world as your pesticide. You have a plant that has toxins in its leaves, so you boil it down and then you use that. That would be a first generation pesticide. All right, so the very things that made this awesome are the things that made it eventually into a nightmare. DDT kills all kinds of pests. It is a broad spectrum, so it's toxic to a lot of stuff. That means it's absolutely going to kill more than one kind of organism. And it doesn't just kill pests on our crops, it also kills mosquitoes, which are a vector for a lot of diseases. DDT used to be sprayed at the beach. Kids would play in the fog of the DDT truck as it came by, until we found out that it's called persistent. That means it literally doesn't break down ever. It gets into our waterways, it stays in our soil, which is good for killing insects because only one application will do you for forever. But then because it's broad spectrum, it kills everything. And as you're going to find out, there's something called biomagnification, which we're going to talk about here in a second, where a tiny bit of this stuff that's not a big deal in lower parts of the food chain concentrates as it moves up the food chain. And then by the time it gets to apex predators, it's a huge problem, which is something that this woman, Rachel Carson, when she published her book in 1962 called Silent Spring, said that it's because of that biomagnification, which we're going to talk about in a second, has become a problem for apex predators like birds. It was killing them outright and then indirectly, which we'll talk about in a few minutes or in class. And again, why are these things strictly controlled? It's because of their persistence. We found out, again, that a huge problem. Side note, Rachel Carson, it took a long time for people to believe her because she was, after all, a hysterical woman. But she was considered the mother of the environmental preservation movement, really. So she kind of got the whole ball rolling of, hey, maybe what we're doing is kind of not good for our place in this world. Okay. How is glyphosate used without killing crops? I already talked about that. That's Roundup. In order to be able to use it so it doesn't hurt crops, your crops have to be genetically modified to resist it. So you have to make sure that you're using a plant, like, again, soybeans, that is genetically programmed to not be affected by Roundup. This is... let's see. Differentiate between broad spectrum and narrow spectrum. That that is pretty self-explanatory. What is persistence? Again, that means that you can stick around in the environment and you don't break down. We have started, again, going back to DDT, we have found noticeable levels of it in polar bears, which are nowhere near any of the spraying areas. Now, that being said, we don't make it here anymore for use in the United States. It is used in other countries because mosquito-borne diseases are so bad that the DDT sticking around is actually a better option. But we have learned to not spread it around like cream cheese on a bagel. It's used in a very targeted method and as little as is humanly possible. Okay, so... visit figure, okay, 247. So we will do a demo in class to kind of illustrate biomagnification. But basically, here's what happens. You have DDT at a very low level, and a bunch of little phytoplankton absorb it. And then zooplankton eat it, and every single little bit they eat gets deposited in the fatty tissues of their body, so then it builds up. Now you have little fishes that eat the zooplankton, and every single one that they eat, basically it stays with them. I mean, think about like a little kid collecting, rocks all day. They don't get rid of them. They're all right there in their pocket. Now you have big fish that eat the little fish, and now they eat all that stuff and it concentrates. And then you have this apex predator that all of a sudden is consuming a toxic level of this stuff. It bioaccumulates in each individual organism, and then it biomagnifies as you move up the food chain. So we will do a demo to make this very clear in class. How does individual use of pesticides compare to agricultural use of pesticides? It turns out that individuals, here it is right here, pesticide use used on the average U.S. homeowner's lawn is 10 times the amount typically used on croplands. Farmers get it, and plus also it costs a lot of money, so they're going to want to use as little as is humanly possible. Unfortunately, a lot of individuals in the United States think if a little is good, more is better, and so they nuke the heck out of their lawn, and not realizing that there is no way. When it rains, the stuff is going to wash somewhere, and it's going to be problematic for somebody or something. Benefits and drawbacks of synthetic pesticide use. So this is where you need to just go ahead and read this yourself. Again, I can't overstate how much the use of DDT has saved people's lives. Increases food supplies, again, very important for folks who are starving. If you keep your plants around, then that means that you have less soil erosion. Reduced crossing, works fast. Newer pesticides are safer to use. This is absolutely true. We are finally creating pesticides that do what they're supposed to do. A lot of times, instead of killing the organism, they will disrupt its life cycle. As an example, with mosquitoes here in Southwest Florida, we use something called malathion, and it's sprayed when they're a larvae, which means they go through different stages. They're an egg, then there's this little wormy thing called a larvae, and then they metamorphosize into the mosquito. Well, if you can disrupt their life cycle and let's say make it so that they can't change from a larvae to mosquito, you're good. And malathion does that, and once it does its job, it actually breaks down to non-toxic, smaller little bits. So we're getting better at this stuff. Problems. This is huge. You can't kill 100% of pests. So which ones survive? The ones that are pre-adapted to survive. They happen to have a mutation that allows them to reproduce, and then that means your next generation suddenly is resistant to that particular pesticide. It's one of the reasons why we have to kind of rotate the type of pesticide that we use. We also see this, and we'll talk about this later, in bacteria. It's one of the reasons why we have more and more diseases that no longer respond to antibiotics because of careless use of antibiotics. We have essentially nudged the evolution of these organisms to now be resistant. We will also do an activity that will make that more clear in our class. Be familiar with the idea of a pesticide treadmill. Again, if you finally find them resistant, now you're having to use more and more of it. And so you kind of ramp up using this poison, and again, you will probably end up harming something that is not your target, like, bees. And, this right here, sometimes if it's too broad spectrum, it absolutely harms wildlife. Again, read all of this stuff right here, and threatening human health. Please make sure that you read the stuff so you're not just getting these platitudes, these general things. Really make sure that you get into the specifics there. This is a really great graphic on how the use of, the ineffective use of pesticides can end up forcing evolution to create these organisms that are suddenly resistant to the pesticides. So please make sure you look at this one, 12.22. Pesticide use facilitate, okay, we already talked about that. Describe the events in Borneo. This is hilarious. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. So in 1955, there was a huge problem with malaria in this place called Borneo. You can look up where it is in the Indonesian islands. The WHO, which is the World Health Organization, sprayed the whole place to kill the mosquitoes. Here's the problem. It was a broad spectrum pesticide, and it also killed other insects, including flies and cockroaches that lived in the houses. Their houses were made of wood, and then they had something called a thatched roof, which means it was made of organic material. So it was like palm fronds. So, but the problem is that the lizards then started dying off because they ate all of these cockroaches and flies that were either dead or almost dead, and they gorged themselves. The problem is all of the toxin that was in them then built up in the fatty tissues in these guys, so they basically killed themselves. Then the cats that lived in the villages that were there to control the rats that carried the plague started dying because they started eating those lizards. So then the rat population went nuts, which then meant that that the plague also started killing people. So it was this whole unintended consequence. And then the World Health Organization had to get pilots from Great Britain. They rounded up all the stray cats they could find in England and literally parachuted them, not individually, they're not like wearing tiny little goggles and tiny little backpacks, but in boxes to Borneo so that they could go ahead and get the rat population under control. Remember, by the way, that rats don't carry the plague, it's the fleas on the rats. And then here also, the villagers' roofs began to fall in because it had also killed the wasps and whatnot that fed on the caterpillars that were coincidentally not affected by this, and the caterpillars started eating the people's houses. So, whenever humans think that they're like, they take a sledgehammer to something, they're like, yeah, what could possibly go wrong? Something is going to happen. Remember, again, that's the whole cane toad philosophy of it all. You know, you think you're doing this good thing, but because you're kind of doing something that is very much at odds with the way that the world is already set up, it doesn't turn out so hot. So being a little bit more subtle and creative with the way that we approach environmental problems is probably the way to go. All right, so let's see. How has pesticide use impacted crop loss due to pests? The problem is not a lot. So go ahead and do this. It's not really making a huge dent. So that tells us there should be another way, which there absolutely is. The good news is there aren't a whole lot of laws you need to know anymore. So this law, actually, just for your information, regulates the kind of pesticides that you can buy, so you're not buying something that's going to end up killing you later on. So that's all here, but you don't need to know about FIFRA. Okay. This one is really interesting. This is not a question that I put on there, but it's just kind of an interesting concept. A lot of the pesticides that we have banned for use in the U.S., we give to other countries where they spray it on the food that, yes, you've got it. They end up sending back to us that we sell in our grocery stores. Okay, so what are some alternatives? You can bring in natural predators. Now, again, you want to make sure that you're bringing in things that are natural to the environment. As an example, there's this little green guy called an aphid, and you can literally buy bags of ladybugs at even through Amazon, and then they're like tiny little lions, and they'll go and eat all the aphids for you. So you kind of ramp up the natural predators that you have. But again, you've got to be really careful about this so that you don't inadvertently cause another problem. Bring in parasites of that particular organism that's giving you issues, because it's, again, a very targeted approach. So again, you've got problems right here. Sometimes the agents can multiply and become pests themselves. Well, no duh. Another interesting thing is that insects usually communicate when they are ready to reproduce through something called pheromones. So what you can do is take pheromones and put them on even just something as simple as a sticky piece of paper. So basically the insect is getting a hey baby vibe from this piece of paper and goes up to it and says, hey, what's up? Gets caught on the paper and dies. You can kind of trick them to go into to traps. You can also use hormones that disrupt their normal life cycle, so preventing it from reaching maturity. The downside, of course, it can take a little while to work. So that's hormonal disruptors. That's all in there. How can polycultures be used? You plant things that provide habitats for the predators. Also, when you rotate crops, insects are not very bright, and so if you move where one crop is from the next, they're like, I don't know where it is, even though it's like right next to where it was before. There are certain plants, like I believe marigolds, that naturally are insect. They're like first generation. They send out that go away signal to insects, and you can ring your crops with those, and they'll keep everybody away. Crop rotation I already talked about. What are some other methods that can be used as alternative pest control? Again, genetically engineering, some answers there. Okay, we did crop rotation. All of this goes together to something called integrated pest management, and it's a very, very specific list of things that you do. First of all, you determine how much of my crops can I lose to pests and be okay with it. You know, am I all right losing 5 to 10%? If that's the case, then good, have at it. Then you use biological methods, cultivation control. Your very, very last resort is using synthetic pesticides. Please notice you still will use them, but it is your last choice as opposed to your first choice. Oh, this is another fun. Using large machines to vacuum harmful pests, that always cracks me up. But you can even use hot water. You can use very diluted soap that you spray onto plants to kill organisms. So you basically use that as a last resort instead of a first resort. The downside to all of this is it's very specific to your biome and to the crops that you're growing. And what works one year may not work the next. So it actually requires some thought and some planning. But it has been incredibly, incredibly successful where it is currently used. I mean, look at this. In Japan, many farmers save money by using ducks for pest control. If you guys remember from the city farm simulation we did, chickens are a great thing that you can use for integrated pest management. Not only are you getting an organism that eats all of your pests, you're also getting their poop, which then fertilizes your soil, and all of the scratching kind of loosens the soil and helps aerate the soil as well. Why don't we do this currently? Because we don't. It's just not traditional. So it's just a mind shift thing to being able to use it. But again, it has some drawbacks. Make sure that you read those. The rest of the semester is all about that pro and con list. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about, okay, it's all done. So that is the extent of pest control, and there you go, we're all done.